The room is quiet when Marilyn Manson speaks. The cameras hum softly. The air feels heavy, and his voice lower. Slower than the world remembers, trembles between confession and defiance. At 60, he says, "You stop pretending to be what they made you." He pauses, exhales smoke into the light. Johnny was the only one who called when everyone else turned off their phones. It's a simple sentence, yet it cuts through decades of noise, the noise of headlines, trials, broken idols. Once, they were two of the most desired men in the world, a rock star and an actor, each building his own mythology from the bones of rebellion. But somewhere between art and anarchy, they became symbols of something darker, outcasts of the very culture they once defined. In 2021, while the world was busy judging, they were quietly surviving. Manson, accused and abandoned, found himself exiled. Depp, wounded by his own public crucifixion, had learned how silence can become a prison. Both men, stripped of fame's illusion, turned toward the only place where the world's noise could not reach, each other. They were not saints, not even close. Their bond was born not from purity, but from recognition. Both had seen the worst in themselves reflected in the other. And in that mirror, there was no judgment, only the raw truth of two broken men clinging to what little humanity they had left. For years, Hollywood whispered about their dark brotherhood. Tattoos, late-night visits, private concerts, cryptic messages, a ritual of loyalty misunderstood as madness. But underneath it all was something that frightened people more than scandal ever could: empathy. Because what if monsters could love? What if exile could create something purer than fame ever did? Now, at 60, Manson no longer cares about redemption. What he wants is understanding, not from the crowd, but from history itself. In the faint light of his studio, his eyes look tired but unafraid. "People think chaos destroys," he says softly. "But sometimes, it's the only thing that saves you." And that's where the story begins in the Brotherhood of Chaos. Before the world turned on them, they were the architects of its dreams. Johnny Depp, the man with a face that could wear pain like poetry, and Marilyn Manson, the nightmare poet who made darkness sound like liberation. Together, they were the embodiment of a generation's rebellion. Two figures who danced on the edge of morality and art, adored and feared in equal measure. In the late 1990 seconds, they were untouchable. Depp had already shed the skin of teenage fame and turned himself into Hollywood's most elusive creature, a movie star who despised being one. He wore his contradictions like armor tattoos of broken promises, love letters inked on skin, words for those who had left. Directors called him the last romantic outlaw. He didn't act, he vanished into characters. Pirates, lunatics, wounded dreamers, all fragments of a man trying to escape his own reflection. Manson, meanwhile, was crafting his own myth from the ashes of America's fears. With pale skin and a mouth like a wound, he was the preacher of the grotesque, a man who screamed about God, fame, and emptiness while dressed like a demon. He was banned, condemned, idolized. He knew that outrage was a language, and he spoke it fluently. Yet behind the stage makeup, behind the spectacles of blood and thunder, was a man obsessed with literature, beauty, and loneliness. When they met, something unspoken passed between them, not admiration, but recognition. They saw in each other a twin spirit, both condemned to be misunderstood. Depp once said, half joking, He's like a brother who took the darker road, and somehow it's the same road. They became inseparable in a way that baffled the industry. Photos began to appear, the two of them laughing in dim clubs, whispering in corners, disappearing into private rooms where the lights burned too low to see clearly. Manson appeared in Depp's films. Depp played guitar on Manson's albums. They inked each other's skin twin tattoos that read, "No reason." When asked what it meant, Depp simply said, "Because we never needed one." The media loved to romanticize the friendship until it became too strange, too intimate, too uncontrollable. What began as fascination turned to moral panic. Toxic men. Headlines screamed. Degenerates. Fallen idols. But none of that noise mattered in those early years when fame still felt like a language they could share. In interviews, Manson would describe Depp as the calm in my chaos. Depp, in turn, would smile and say, "As the poet of the apocalypse." Together, they played out a theater of contradictions, beauty and horror, tenderness and destruction, and Hollywood, for a time, couldn't look away. But fame has a way of punishing those who mirror its hypocrisy too clearly. For every red carpet, there was a darker room waiting afterward. For every performance, there was a night that didn't end. They surrounded themselves with music, smoke, and the illusion of control. But fame, like a drug, is never satisfied. By the 2010 seconds, cracks began to appear. Depp's face, once the symbol of eternal youth, began to look haunted. The roles became darker, the press more vicious. Manson's concerts turned into exorcisms of pain. There was less laughter, now only the stubborn loyalty of two men who understood that the world loves to build altars just to burn them down. Their bond remained, even as everything else collapsed. Manson was there when Depp's marriage fell apart and the world chose sides. Depp was there when Manson faced accusations that erased decades of art overnight. Each watched the other become the enemy of the public imagination. And in those moments, their friendship changed shape from a celebration of rebellion to a shelter from it. To the world, they were still dangerous, a warning of everything wrong with celebrity excess. But to each other, they were just human. Two men who had lost the privilege of innocence long ago, yet refused to lose the last thing they believed in, loyalty. There is an old photo rarely seen of them sitting together on a couch in Manson's Los Angeles home. A guitar between them, cigarettes in hand, eyes half closed. Behind them, a painting of an angel without a face. There are no smiles, no poses, just quiet understanding. It looks less like a portrait of fame and more like the aftermath of it. They knew the illusion couldn't last. The audience that once adored their defiance now demanded repentance. But what the world never understood was that their defiance wasn't arrogance, it was armor. In a world that worships purity, they were willing to be impure, to exist without apology. As the lights dimmed on their public lives, a silence began to grow between the noise. That silence, heavy, unspoken, was where the truth started to live. And somewhere in that silence, a phone kept ringing. One man's world collapsing, the other's already in ruins. But the call was always answered. Because loyalty, in the end, is not about being right. It's about staying when everyone else leaves. And the illusion of perfection, that fragile golden myth Hollywood once painted around them, was already beginning to crumble. Soon, the world would see what lay behind it. There is something haunting about the way silence falls on two men who once owned the noise. For years, Johnny Depp and Marilyn Manson were defined by sound guitars screaming, cameras clicking, applause crashing like waves. But when the world turned its back, the noise stopped. And in that sudden quiet, the truth began to breathe. Manson described it once, not in an interview, but in a handwritten note found in a book he gave Depp years earlier. It read, "Chaos was our language." But what happens when the music stops? The question lingered like smoke. Because both of them already knew the answer. When the music stops, you hear yourself. And they didn't like what they heard. For Depp, silence was filled with ghosts, the echo of lost roles, lost friends, lost love. He had lived so long inside other people's stories that he no longer knew which voice was his. The lawsuits, the betrayals, the headlines, they had stripped away the last illusion of control. He would retreat into the shadows of his own house, guitar in hand, a bottle nearby, the same song playing over and over. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would text Manson one word, "Still?" Manson always replied, "Still." Their friendship became less about rebellion and more about survival. When the world sees you as a villain, you begin to wonder if maybe it's right. Manson's nights were long, filled with insomnia and self-punishment. He painted obsessively distorted faces, angels with their mouths sewn shut. He once told Depp that art was the only place left where guilt doesn't need forgiveness. They were two men trapped between myth and remorse. Fame had made them immortal in the eyes of others. But inside, they were decaying. Quietly. Beautifully. It was the kind of pain that fame doesn't heal, the pain of being misunderstood for so long that you start to misunderstand yourself. For years, they had played the role of monsters, and the world had been eager to believe it. But the truth was softer, sadder. Neither of them wanted to destroy, they just didn't know how to exist, gently. They had mistaken chaos for freedom because calm, to them, always felt like death. When Depp spoke of Manson in private, it wasn't with admiration, but with tenderness. "He's fragile," he once told a friend, "like glass under leather." And when Manson spoke of Depp, it was with a kind of reverence. "Johnny reminds me that I am not entirely unhuman." That was their secret beneath the tattoos and makeup. The scandals and masks, there was empathy. Deep, unspoken, inconvenient empathy. It was the kind of understanding that doesn't ask questions or demand explanations. It simply says, "I see you," even now. But empathy has a cost. It binds you to the suffering of the other. And when both are drowning, compassion can start to feel like weight. There were nights when Manson would spiral, his house dark, the air thick with resentment. Depp would drive over without a word, sit beside him, light a cigarette, and say nothing. Silence became their confession booth. They didn't need to talk about guilt. They were made of it. What held them together was not fame, or even friendship in the ordinary sense. It was recognition, the same kind of recognition one exile gives another. Theirs was a love story without romance, a kinship carved from ruin. Yet, in that ruin, there were flickers of beauty. Small, almost invisible moments of grace. Depp strumming a guitar while Manson sketched quietly beside him, a laugh breaking through the heaviness of a shared memory. A mutual understanding that fame had given them everything and taken away the ability to feel it. In another life, they might have been poets, but in this one, they were survivors. Each carried the guilt of 1,000 performances of every time they had played the monster to please an audience that secretly wanted to believe monsters were real. The tragedy wasn't that they were misunderstood. The tragedy was that they had learned to live with it. And yet, somewhere in the middle of the chaos, they still found pieces of innocence. When the tabloids called them unrepentant, they laughed. Not because it wasn't true, but because repentance no longer meant anything to men who had been judged beyond redemption. In private, they were different. Manson, who the world saw as cruel, would check on Depp's children's drawings, hang them in his studio. Depp, who the world saw as distant, once sent Manson a handwritten note after one of his concerts. It said, "Don't apologize for being the mirror." That was what they were to each other, mirrors, reflecting not only the darkness, but also the last flickers of humanity hiding behind it. Still, mirrors have edges. Their connection was both salvation and temptation. Sometimes, Manson would push too far, too much darkness, too much excess, and Depp would pull away, quietly, only to return when the silence grew unbearable. It was a cycle: closeness, distance, forgiveness, like tides against the same rock. Their bond defied explanation because it was built on contradictions. It was intimate but not confessional, loyal but not idealized. In each other's company, they could be brutally honest, not about the world, but about themselves. They were no longer trying to be famous, or righteous, or forgiven. They were just trying to stay human in a world that had decided they weren't. By the time Manson turned 60, the lines between myth and man had blurred completely. He was no longer the monster on stage, and Depp was no longer the pirate on screen. They were just two old friends who had outlived their legends, sitting quietly in the ruins of what used to be glory. And perhaps that was the hidden truth all along. Fame doesn't destroy people, misunderstanding does. What the world saw as chaos was, to them, the only form of honesty left. In the end, they didn't need to be forgiven. They just needed to be remembered, not for what they were accused of, but for the strange, imperfect loyalty that bound them when no one else stayed. As one of Manson's old lyrics once whispered, "We are the nobodies, trying to be somebodies." But the real truth is simpler: they were somebody to each other. And sometimes, that is the only kind of redemption left. The revelation did not arrive with a scream, but with a sigh. Not a confession in front of cameras, but a whisper shared in dim light, the kind of truth that sounds too quiet to be scandal. In one of his rare interviews, after years of silence, Marilyn Manson was asked about Johnny Depp. The journalist expected denial, distance, or deflection. Instead, Manson smiled faintly and said, "He never left my side, even when it could have ruined him." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, he didn't hide behind irony or provocation. It was not an excuse. It was gratitude and guilt. That was the moment the world glimpsed the core of their bond, not rebellion, but loyalty, the kind that cost everything. When the public demanded separation, when every friendship became a liability, Depp stayed. He didn't defend Manson in headlines or speeches. He did something harder: he listened. He called when everyone else stayed silent. He visited when doors were closed. He chose empathy over safety. And that choice, in Hollywood, was almost suicidal. Manson knew it. He once said to a friend, "He didn't save me. He just didn't run." That sentence revealed more than any documentary ever could. Because not running, staying, is the rarest act of courage in a world that feeds on abandonment. But loyalty has a shadow. When Depp's own career was under fire, the world used Manson's name as a weapon against him. Guilt by association became another form of punishment. People demanded purity, as if human connection could be sanitized. Yet both men understood something their critics never would: Compassion is messy. It contaminates. It makes you complicit in someone's pain. Their friendship became a mirror of hypocrisy, proof that society loves forgiveness only when it is convenient. They were accused of protecting each other's darkness, when in truth, they were protecting each other's humanity. For years, the public asked for explanations. But the real revelation wasn't in what they said it was, in what they endured. They had learned that survival is not about being blameless. It's about refusing to disappear. There's a story Depp once told quietly at a private event. During one of his lowest moments, after losing a film and facing endless lawsuits, he came home to find a package on his doorstep. Inside was a small black box. No letter. No signature. Just a single matchstick wrapped in a strip of paper. On it, one word, still. He knew exactly who it was from. That word, their shared code. Their private promise had outlived every rumor, every betrayal, every exile. It meant, are you still there? Are you still alive inside the noise? And the answer? Always. Was yes. This was the revelation that changed everything, that even in disgrace, in the ruins of reputation, there was still loyalty. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. For Manson, that friendship became the last thread connecting him to the person he used to be before fame turned into accusation. For Depp, it was a reminder that not all monsters are real. Some are just reflections of wounds too deep to hide. In the quiet spaces between them and music. In silence. In shared exhaustion, they discovered something purer than fame had ever offered. Honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't need to be liked. Only to be real. And perhaps that is the greatest shock of all, that behind the headlines, beneath the chaos, what held them together wasn't darkness, but light. Dim. Trembling. And imperfect, but light nonetheless. When asked, years later, if he regretted their friendship, Depp didn't hesitate. No, he said softly. It's the only one that was never based on lies. That was the confession no one expected. Not an apology. Not a defense. Just the truth stripped of artifice. Echoing in the hollow space between two men the world chose to forget. And somewhere, in that silence, the Brotherhood of Chaos stopped being a scandal. It became something rarer, a testament. In the end, their story was never about scandal, it was about survival. Two men who had spent their lives performing for the world finally learned the quiet art of being unseen. Johnny Depp and Marilyn Manson were not saints or villains. Not victims or heroes. They were simply proof that even in the wreckage of reputation, friendship can still exist, raw, flawed, unfiltered. Hollywood loves redemption arcs. But theirs was different. There was no tearful apology, no public forgiveness, no grand return. Instead, there was silence, a deeper kind of healing. They stopped needing to explain who they were, because they had found someone who already knew. Manson, once the symbol of rebellion, became the embodiment of endurance. Depp, once the face of fantasy, became the voice of quiet defiance. Together, they revealed a truth that most of fame tries to bury. That understanding is more radical than judgment. The world prefers neat endings. It wants its fallen stars to either repent or disappear. But real life, like real friendship, refuses to fit the script. Their bond remained imperfect, bruised, but intact, a fragile thread between two men who refused to abandon each other when abandonment was the trend. When Manson said, he was the only one who called, it wasn't just gratitude. It was a eulogy for empathy, for the simple act of staying when everyone else walks away. Perhaps that's what loyalty really means, not the denial of someone's darkness, but the recognition of their light, however faint it flickers. Their friendship didn't save them. It didn't erase their mistakes or silence the noise. But it did something gentler. It reminded them that even in exile, they were not alone. And maybe that is the quiet moral of their story, that connection, even between the broken, is still sacred. That compassion, though costly, is the last rebellion left in a world built on spectacle. As the lights fade, two figures remain shadows against the wall, smoke curling upward, a faint laugh somewhere in the dark. The world calls it chaos. They call it brotherhood.